All right, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. My name is Robert Kiley, and I'm a city councillor in Kingston, Ontario. I'm also a high school teacher and the coordinator for the Basic Income Canada Network Youth Network. And so we're very glad that you could be here. I see some familiar faces from our call last week, which we'll talk about a bit in a minute. And I see some new faces too. So our genuine appreciation for all of you logging on and taking time to talk with us about basic income tonight. I wanted to give a bit of context about the Basic Income Canada Network. For the last number of years, they have been the definitive source of basic information on basic income in Canada. They're a compilation of practitioners, professionals, academic, and activists who give the media and politicians the best evidence that they can on a basic income. So you may have heard names like Professor Evelyn Forget or Senator Hugh Segal as big names in the big movement. And they are just a number of people who are looking to provide yourselves, maybe some of the organizations you represent, and other people across the country data on the ways in which basic income is a very effective and very needed social policy in our context. So the Basic Income Canada Youth Network is a spin-off of that. And I'm joined here tonight by the steering committee members for that group. Maybe you can just wave as I mention your name. We have Daniel Snyder, who's in Toronto. He's an activist there. Chloe Halpenny, who's in Ottawa, an academic, and Kendall David, who's there as well in Ottawa, who's a grad student at Carleton. And for the last number of months, we've been meeting and discussing ways in which we can reach out and build allies with other youth organizations and other youth activists and academics who are wanting to see basic income advanced in Canada. And our first larger group meeting was held on April 1st, like I mentioned. Some of you were here for that, and that's great that you've come back. And we try to, at a high level, answer some general questions about a basic income and what it might mean for the nation. And so from that conversation, we've been able to develop a one-pager that gives a basic recap of what we talked about, which we can send out to you afterwards. And we're going to do the same tonight in hoping to answer some questions at a bit of a deeper level and do some what we're calling myth busting around basic income, because there are lots of misperceptions out there on the topic. And at this moment, as I'm sure many of you have seen, basic income is in the media in a very forceful way, and it's being discussed such that we want to ensure the vision we have for basic income is being addressed, and any questions you may have are really cleared up so we can advance this cause. So that's kind of where we're going tonight. A few practical housekeeping. Recording this call. So for those of you that don't want to be recorded, please feel free to send a private message to Chloe in chat or email us to the email that you received this invite from, and we'll be happy to edit you out. The reason we're recording it is because we want to develop further resources for youth organizations across the country. And we want to make sure that as we do that, we're addressing the questions that you have from a youth perspective. So we're recording it for that reason. But by all means, if you don't want to be a part of that, just let us know and we'll make sure that happens. The other thing we want to let you know is that for now, you're obviously muted, and that just so we avoid any feedback. We're all learning a lot with Zoom these days, so be patient with us as we do that. And the last thing on the technical side is we're hoping that you can ask some of your questions tonight through the chat feature. And as a way of testing that out to make sure that everyone can work that, can you just write a Y for yes or an N for no if you've heard of basic income in the news in the last 2 weeks? We'll see if everyone has the chat functioning. Excellent. So a whole lot of Ys, which is one of the reasons we are here. And tonight, as we go along, if you have questions, feel free to pop up your physical hand or your virtual hand, which is one of the features as well. And I'll keep a bit of a speakers list so we can answer your questions. And also Chloe will be monitoring the chat. So feel free to put any of your thoughts, any of your comments right in there, and she'll be keeping an eye on that. So without further ado, we're going to start this by each of the members of the steering committee telling us a bit more about themselves and busting one of the main myths that they've heard in their time working on basic income. And that will take about 20 minutes, half an hour, and from there we'll go into an open Q&A. So Daniel, we'll start with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel and I work at the Hospital for Sick Children as a research software developer. And in the past, I've hosted basic income meetups in Toronto, and I've contributed to projects at BICYN and Ontario's OBIN. And today I wanted to myth bust a common criticism about basic income, that basic income will make the kids lazy. And the research data that I've found refutes this claim. In Manitoba in Canada in the 70s, there was an experiment called Mincome, and it found that UBI created very little disincentive to work. Researchers found a 1% reduction for men and a 3 to 5% reduction for married or unmarried women. Women were delaying the return to work after having children mostly, and men were more likely to finish high school instead of leaving to get a job earlier. And in the US in the 70s, there was a program, or there was a so-called war on poverty. And there were 6 experiments in 6 different states that also found the reduction of hours worked by primary earners in a home was quite small. And that the largest reduction of hours was due to youth staying in high school until completion. More recently, studies in Alaska have seen an increase in jobs and employment as a result of their unconditional cash. And in London, UK, they studied homeless people and they found that giving them cash, what they used it on was to move into housing. They started planning for their future and developing independent living skills. They addressed their health issues. And some people said that the homeless would try to milk the system for drugs and alcohol. But the results actually found the opposite, a strong trend towards health. So I think there will always be some people in society who are lazy, and basic income will either not change that or have the opposite effect. People will become less lazy, because I suspect everyone wants to improve themselves. And for many people, it's not that they are lazy, it's that it's so hard to find meaningful work these days that also pays the bills. So much of employment today is underpaid pseudo-slavery that contributes to personal and collective malaise. So as youth, what we need and want are more experiences and experimentation, and that's what UBI can provide us. UBI gives us the ability to take career risks, to find our passions, to have mental stability, and to continually reinvent ourselves. And this is what we need to grow the economy. So I don't think basic income will make people lazy. I think people are going to be more passionate, more productive. So thanks. And next we're going to hear from Chloe, who's our expert young researcher.
Oh dear, that was an intimidating introduction. Awesome, thank you, Daniel. So as Daniel mentioned, my name is Chloe, and I come to basic income very much through an academic or research point of view. So I spent the past couple years in school. So I started doing a master's of social policy at the London School of Economics, where I became interested in sort of the ways that governments distribute benefits to people. And then a master's of gender studies at the University of Cambridge, where I'm specifically looking at the gendered implications of these programs. So in particular, what my research looked at was conducting qualitative interviews with participants in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, which I think many of you may have heard of at this point, to try to explore what the feminist potential of basic income programs were. And that was some of the only qualitative or interview-based research that is out there on basic income. A lot of it is sort of focused more on quantitative data, and sort of among the only research that's been done so far on the Ontario pilot in particular. And now I work as a social policy researcher at the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation in Ottawa, which is a research and evaluation company for social policy in particular. So coming from that sort of perspective as a young researcher, that's something that I hear a lot about sort of in the spaces that I'm in, is the myth that do we actually have enough reliable, high quality evidence and research on what the impacts of a basic income would be to actually justify its implementation in Canada? So is the research there, in other words? So to that myth, the idea that there isn't enough data out there, that we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants with this, first of all, I would say tell that to the literally hundreds of academic articles on basic income that's taking up all my computer space. But all jokes aside, it's really encouraging, I think, that people are concerned with sort of what the research on basic income is. it points to people being interested in evidence-based policy, and we obviously want to be encouraging policymakers and people in power to be implementing policies and programs that are grounded in evidence and not partisanship or ideology. But that said, the reality is that there's been a ton of excellent and rigorous research done on so many elements of basic income. And in fact, there are academics and researchers who devote their entire professional careers to specifically researching basic income. This has included research that demonstrates that a basic income is affordable, some really highly theoretical things that look at, how basic income fits into theories of justice, if you want to get really philosophical about it. Econometric modeling to show what a basic income's effect would be on poverty levels or tax revenue, and some of the research that Daniel mentioned on sort of what impacts on labor market participation would be. And this type of research and so much more has been done for decades and by folks from around the world, not just in high-income countries like Canada, but also in low and middle-income countries. And if there are specific things that people are looking for, as I mentioned, hundreds of articles, shoot me a message and I'm happy to share things with you. And sort of not only sort of some of this, but there actually has been a lot of research that sort of draws specifically on experiments and pilots to show that basic income has really promising potential when you look at impacts in particular. So Daniel mentioned the 1970s experiment that happened in Manitoba, right here in Canada, and some really important and groundbreaking research done by Evelyn Forget, but also others showed that basic income resulted in a decrease in healthcare services use and how often people were going to the hospital, a reduction in crime, higher high school graduation rates, and research in pilots elsewhere has shown, again, improved health outcomes, reductions in stress, that people are happier, that they're more trustful of government institutions, and research that just kind of shows, what people are spending money on, that people go spend money on clothes and food and to pay bills and not sort of these malicious things that people suspect that they'll spend money on. At the same time, I'll mention that there's all this research out there, but you will equally find research that is maybe less optimistic towards basic income. And to that, I would say that research, no matter how objective researchers will claim to be, that research is always sort of underlined by values and people's belief systems, and people can interpret evidence in a way that supports their argument. So just as there's a lot of evidence that suggests that basic income could be a really positive thing, there's also people who will analyze sometimes that exact same evidence in a different way. So sort of the data that Daniel brought forward about sort of really small results in people leaving the labor market or leaving their jobs in the Manitoba case because they were receiving a basic income. Some people might take that data and they'll say, well, the research shows that 1% of men left their jobs. Basic income causes people to leave work, so we don't want it. Another researcher will look at that and say, okay, well, what kind of jobs were those? Were they precarious work? Were they unsafe jobs? Were people overqualified for those jobs? And can really interpret that data in totally different ways. Another way that I would challenge this myth, and this is something that I think is really important, is while we're questioning sort of whether the research is there to support basic income, which I think there is, we also need to accept the reality that there's also a ton of research out there that shows that the systems that we have in place right now, instead of a basic income, do not work. So thinking in Ontario of ODSP, the Ontario Disability Support Program, and Ontario Works, which are sort of Ontario's quote unquote welfare programs, there is a ton of evidence that suggests that those programs keep people in poverty, that people experience like poor health outcomes and mistrusting government institutions, and that people aren't encouraged to go into work when they're on this program because they're struggling just to stay alive. So there's a ton of data and research that shows that the status quo isn't working. So, the question really becomes not one of proof or evidence when it comes to basic income, but really one of will, not just in politics, but also among Canadians more broadly. And I'll close sort of the research element by saying that there definitely are specific areas where I would say we don't have enough research yet. I'm a researcher. I will always say that more research can be done because I need a job. Kidding, but to say it seriously, there's always other elements or lenses that can be explored. And one thing, just because of who we have on this call today, I think that there's still definitely space to do more research on how basic income applies specifically to youth, both in terms of how you perceive basic income or what youth ideas about basic income are, but as well as sort of what the impacts of a basic income on youth in particular would be. And there's some stuff out there on this, a lot of it sort of more by way of opinion pieces or things like that. But that's definitely a gap, and there are others as well. I touched on age and sort of the role basic income might play for younger recipients a little bit in my research, where people sort of said, pointed to the idea of social policy models that assume that people, especially in their early and late 20s, are working in full-time jobs with benefits, and how for youth today especially, that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, and basic income sort of responds to the fact that a lot of people, especially older youth, aren't necessarily captured in other social policy programs. But that's, again, kind of just a drop in the bucket, and there's a lot more to explore there. So just some things to think about, but I think that there's not enough research to support a basic income is definitely a stereotype that needs to be put to rest. So I'll pass it on to Robert now.
Thanks, Chloe. And I'm going to pick up on the idea of the status quo not working and talk about basic income in relation to the need to raise minimum wage, particularly moving towards a minimum wage. And there's a myth out there that basic income is at odds with the need to raise the minimum wage and to get to a living wage. So in other words, some people might say that if you have a basic income, employers will either pay their employees less, or that they won't have the incentive that they need to support a move towards a just wage. And it's something that I heard a lot when I was in provincial politics. Before I got elected to city council, I was the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario, and we rigorously promoted a basic income for years, almost a decade by my count. And I don't bring this up in a partisan way by any stretch of the imagination. As a councillor, I'm nonpartisan, and also very encouragingly, people from all parties at all levels of government are now supporting a basic income, which is great. But I bring this up because often at debates and meetings, mainly certain anti-poverty advocates would say that a basic income is not helpful because work should be remunerated with living wages, that people should be able to earn what they need to put a roof over their head, and that they shouldn't have to work multiple jobs just to get there. And I really agree with the second half of that sentiment, obviously, because it's, frankly, in my view at least, immoral that people could put 40 hours of work in a week and still not be able to have good food, safe housing, and modest recreation. And there's a whole discussion with other NGOs into what goes into making those calculations of what counts as good food, what is safe housing, what is modest recreation, that I've been a part of, that I think need to inform our work on basic income. But I think it's really important to distill the fact that those two things, living wages and basic income, can actually work together. And particularly that basic income fills gaps that wages, even if they're higher and more just, they just simply cannot meet. So for example, it's now undeniable that we live in the gig economy. So for most of us, corporate lifetime jobs with rich benefits and padded retirement are pretty much gone. And most of us will be left to contract work, the prospect of a few careers, so switch in midlife and then probably in later life as well. And near certain periods, as we see very clearly with COVID-19, of under or unemployment. So when not working or when working part-time, a basic income makes up for the difference between those realities and full-time work. And in turn, or in other words, I guess, basic income lessens the need for people to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. So that way you see that basic income is filling a gap that even if people were earning a living wage, they might not be able to make the money that they need to live. And this is particularly and especially relevant for youth. And we're defining youth, I should have said this at the beginning, we're defining youth fairly broadly based on the United Nations definition of anyone up to the age of 35. So that's a bit of context for some of our comments on youth. But I think thinking about wages and basic income is especially relevant for youth or students, because even in jurisdictions where there is a higher minimum wage, or where municipalities like mine in Kingston have adopted living wage policies, students or youth are often paid less than their so-called adult counterparts, which is patronizing for a number of reasons, which we won't get into, but suffice it to say that basic income would level this playing field and make that type of pay inequity and inequality experienced by young people much less of an issue. Likewise, perhaps obviously, basic income is a robust help for those who cannot work at all. Chloe mentioned ODSP in Ontario, and it's very, very clear from research and lived experience that that's entirely inadequate, and basic income directly addresses that. So in both circumstances, basic income, generally speaking, allows people to be less stressed, less stretched, and in turn more happy and healthy, which is some of the language that Dr. Forget uses. I guess you could say if you're not worried about paying the bills, you're going to have more mental energy to put elsewhere. And that really builds on something I've heard Daniel mention in the past, which is basic income contributing to human flourishing. And I think that's super important. So in summary, you could say that basic income and living wage actually complement one another because they accomplish the same ends in different ways, and that living wages help people thrive, but so does basic income. And that they really should be seen as two sides of the same coin in working for economic justice and not at odds with each other at all. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kendall for our last myth busting.
Okay, hello everybody. It's nice to see you. Well, met some of you, many of you. Okay, so I am going to talk a little bit about why basic income is important outside the context of emergency situations such as global health pandemics, and if basic income is actually affordable long-term for Canada. And so the reason in particular that the affordability thing has come up for me a lot in my work is that I'm from out west. I'm from Alberta. I was born and raised in Calgary, and my entrance into basic income came through practicum placements that I did while I was studying social work at the University of Calgary. My practicum placements were with United Way and with the City of Calgary, and so I was tasked with doing a little bit of research on basic income, whether it's palatable in Alberta, in Calgary specifically. And as you can imagine, it is not necessarily super palatable all the time from out west. There's a pretty strong conservative leaning. And while there are arguments for basic income across the political spectrum, it's a bit of an iffy one out there. Anyways, and so I got asked on a number of occasions in the work that I did on basic income, is it actually affordable? Is it just going to eat into federal debt and whatnot? So to bust this myth, the first thing I want to talk about is the Parliamentary Budget Office report that came out in 2018 that looked at hypothetically, if we were going to apply the model for basic income that was used in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot federally, how much would that cost? And so the total cost that the Parliamentary Budget Office reported was it would be about $76 billion annually for us to be providing a basic income based on that on Ontario model. However, that $76 billion doesn't account for the about $33 billion that the federal government is currently spending on income supports for low-income Canadians. And so when you take out that $33 billion, the working cost would be about $43 billion a year, which sounds like an excessive amount of money. I've never even seen $1 billion in my lifetime. How cool. $1 million. Anyways, so 43 billion sounds like a lot of money. But to put that into context, in 2016-17, the federal government spent $311 billion. And in that same year, they spent $20.7 billion on employment insurance, EI alone, and $22 billion on the Canadian Child Tax Benefit. And so what is pretty interesting about the costing when we're talking about basic income is that while we can say that $43 billion annually is a lot of money, that doesn't account for the provincial savings that would come from replacing or propping up other income security programs. And it also doesn't necessarily account for example, the health savings that we would see from the anticipated benefits to our healthcare system. So I think, at least from my perspective, that a basic income is very affordable from a long-term perspective. And then I also just want to talk really quickly about why this is particularly interesting from a youth perspective and important from an affordability standpoint for younger people. So in 2016, our census showed that only 49.8% of those in their peak working years, so that's people who are 25 to 54, were in full-time, full-year work. So again, that's less than half of people who are in their peak working years in 2016 were working full-time all year round. And when we're looking at the demographics of people who are living under the low income measure in Canada, it's 33% of single working age Canadians are living under the low income. So that's 1.3 million people in Canada. That's half of the people who are under the low income measure are single working age Canadians. And one of the interesting reasons why that is the case is because they often don't qualify for other income security programs like the Canada Child Tax Benefit or Old Age Security Guaranteed Income Supports. And this group also lives in usually extreme poverty, so they're usually making less than $10,000 a year. So anyways, I know that's a little bit of two kind of separate things squished together there, but basic income is certainly affordable from a sustainable standpoint. It's important to have as a safety net. So consider, for example, if we were in this pandemic situation that we are right now, but a basic income had been implemented federally prior to this, we wouldn't necessarily be seeing the same kind of fumbling to get money to people through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or the relaxing of EI policy. So again, very hypothetical, but yeah, I feel like that was a little bit messy, but there you go. If there are questions, please ask them and we can clarify.
That was great. Thanks, Kendall. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Chloe. So I see some activity happening in the chat, so we'll turn to Chloe for that. And anyone else that would like to ask a question, this is a great opportunity. We have about 30 minutes left. We try to touch on some of the high-level things that we've heard in our circles around basic income and some of the potential shortcomings, and show that more often than not, they're not actually the case. But that actually brings me to say one more thing before we move into the question and answer, which is we really want to promote people feeling like they can ask any question, because the movement of basic income through the Basic Income Canada Network and through our own youth network is very varied, and that's welcomed. A few of the presenters you heard mention different sides of the political spectrum, different partisan issues. Different people have different perspective on this issue, and that's okay. So we want to make sure that you feel that this is a safe space. And if there are disagreements, that's also welcome, because we're hoping that in honest Q&A, we can hammer out some of these details, because we really think that this is the moment where we could see basic income implemented. So the more we can discourse on it constructively now, the better we can see that happen, hopefully in months to come. So with that said, Chloe, why don't you do a Q&A from the chat?
Yeah, so I'll say, so we've got, I'll turn it to Katrina in a second. Katrina had a couple questions, and I see Leah raising her hand, which if it was an accident, let me know, but so we can go to Katrina and then Leah and then open it up from there. And yeah, feel free to put things in the chat or raise your hand in the little hand raising thing, or just kind of speak up. This doesn't have to be super formal, but Katrina, on to you.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So my name is Katrina, and I'm the Parliamentary Affairs Advisor for an independent senator from Manitoba. Many of you on the call know me because you are members of the Senators Youth Advisory, and we're really happy to be able to be part of this kind of webinar and to have Chloe kind of as our bridge between both this group and the youth advisors. So this afternoon, I was on a call with Senator McPhedran and about 50 other senators and staff of the Senate who are part of the Senators Working Group on basic income. And so they're looking at serious ways as to how they can push for this to become policy and law, or however it needs to be done within the parliamentary system. And so Senator McPhedran raised the fact that her youth advisors have been looking at this, and obviously that groups like yourselves have been looking at this and wanting to push for this. And they came up with the idea of having a letter written jointly from senators to the minister in question, and possibly the prime minister and others within cabinet, to call and ask for them to do something serious and consider this seriously. And so I have a few questions here that I'd like to pose because I'd like to report back the answers to the parliamentarians and to the senators, because the idea that Senator McFedrin had and others supported was to have youth perspectives included in this original letter and potentially other follow-up letters. And so now is quite timely because, you know, our youth advisory is working on one pager for parliamentarians and other contributions for parliamentarians to consider and to include in their advocacy. But they're looking for this initial letter now that we've learned to be sent out, you know, tomorrow or the day after. So I'm going to read out the few questions that I have. So the first question that I have is, what do you think is the most effective in terms of pushing for basic income and having the public support for this? So a lot of the issues that the senators raise is that a lot of people, you know, within their circles are agreeing with this, but the government obviously will not go for this, especially if they're as they are a minority, if the public doesn't stand behind it. And so they were talking a lot about how do we frame the messaging so that people, for one, understand, even though the whole idea of basic income is, as you know, quite theoretical in a sense because you don't know how it will be implemented, but that's beside the point from what they see it right now. But how would you go essentially about recommending to them for the messaging that they should go to promote this idea?
I can maybe start that off, and then this is also an open floor for people responding, so it doesn't have to be any of the 4 members who presented. Anyone's welcome to answer that. My response would be related to how I set the Q&A up, that basic income genuinely has strong proponents on the left and right. So on the left, talking to the dignity of individuals, the ways in which basic income reduces stigma around a variety of social programming, and streamlines and gives people kind of a one-stop shop for social support. So really playing up the personal side. On the right side of the political spectrum, I think that Kendall is touching on this about the cost savings that come through other social programming and the way in which the streamlining of those programs legitimately would see less cost and less confusing bureaucracy. And I think that's one of the beauties of this movement, is that it can really wed the two together, because in that streamlining, you are promoting the dignity of the person. One of the sound bites that I've used when I've talked about it publicly is that this would end policing of the poor. So individuals don't have to go to City Hall for a discount on transit and then apply at Service Ontario for a different subsidy and then go to the federal government, Service Canada, for a different subsidy there. So it would really allow them to be invested in a very clean way, which is good economically and from a human side. So if anyone wants to add to that, I would say make sure that you hit the finances and the personal stories.
Ken said in the chat that he has things to add to that. Ken, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and then share what you have to say?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ken Yang. I'm with an organization called UBI Works. And I first got into this movement when I was involved with Andrew Yang's campaign in Los Angeles, and then moved back to Toronto to try to do something, you know, here at home where I was born. Regarding the question of showing public support, well, first off, I'd reference a 2016 Angus Reid poll that showed about 54% of people back then said they would support a basic income nationally between $10,000 to $30,000 a year. That's the first one. So it's a little dated, but then there's a 2019 Gallup poll of 10,000 Canadians that showed 75% of Canadians support this. So there's ample data to suggest that there's public support for this. Not to mention that, you know, with every successive generation since the baby boomers, we've seen people's likelihood of entering the middle class drop with every single generation. And what's happening right now is that, you know, we've seen in 3 recessions over 30 years, we've seen 88% of jobs that were displaced in highly automatable and routine jobs. And so with this recession, what we've seen is the acceleration of businesses investing in technology and deploying automation. And a lot of these people who, you know, the 6 million people, let's say, who are getting the CRB right now or are unemployed, many of them will not go back to work once this pandemic is over. And this is especially hard hitting for students and recent graduates at a time when, they need certainty and an income and a foundation below them to actually take risks. Because as you get older, your risk tolerance goes down. If you're a young person, you're just starting out in your career, you need to be able to take that risk. And taking risks means going back to school, maybe starting a business, maybe taking a job you wouldn't have otherwise taken if you maybe had a mortgage or a family. So I would argue that the younger generation is especially hard hit right now. And also, I think there are a good number of senators that have been very vocally advocating for this. Senator Kane Pate, Omid Var, Yupao Wu, and Francis Lankin have sort of been, very vocal champions of this. And I have no doubt that there are a lot of liberals that support this. Jean-Yves Duclos supports this. Mona Fortier supports this. And but what I've heard is that whenever a minister brings up basic income in the House, the PMO sends them a little message, a little nudge to say, don't bring up basic income. And the reason is because it is, despite 75% of Canadians supporting this, the Liberals right now still feel that it's politically risky and too polarizing and it jeopardizes maybe perhaps their sort of centrist favorability to the Canadian population. But it's what you've seen is like, the NDPs, for example, and the Greens, they're willing to take the risk to push UBI, even when there are a lot of people that think, oh, that's a radical libertarian Trojan horse, or that's a radical socialist Trojan horse. They can take that risk, whereas the PMO right now is not willing to take that risk. What they need to see is that this is not a left or right thing. There are MPs across all the major parties, including conservatives, who support this, and really would strengthen the letter to reference cross-political support for universal basic income.
Thanks, Ken. We had a few people that had hands raised, so we'll get to you in 1 second. But Katrina, you said you had 1 or 2 questions, so why don't you just ask them now, and then we can go to the folks who have their hands on.
Thank you so much. That's actually really helpful. And this is still about the letter. So it's funny that you raised all these names of the senators because they are all members of the working group. And Senator Pate actually initiated it. So some of these senators were suggesting today to use this current opportunity, or using the COVID crisis as an opportunity for the support of a temporary basic income system, as a lot of people have alluded to, but to also actively put in place measurement tools to support the design of a permanent program down the road. So what senators were asking essentially is, do you agree as young people, as this group, do you agree with this approach? And if not, what would you recommend or advocate for as a different approach? And then a subsequent question to that is, do you have any outstanding key youth-specific messages you think would be key for us to send to the senators for them to include in the letter, or at least consider including in the letter?
Maybe we can start with Chloe on temporary measures and measurements of programs.
Yeah, I'll start with that, and then if people want to feed in about youth-specific messages, because I'll kind of share my personal perspective. I think that there's a little bit, there's some worry right now, because obviously, I think a lot of folks that are in this conversation sort of see the need for something that's longer term and something that will span beyond just the context of an emergency. At the same time, there are also folks like OBIN, for the Ontario Basic Income Network, comes to mind as people who really advocate for something that's incremental, is a language that they use. And I think I'm hesitant to say that we need to have an all or nothing approach. I think that if something that's temporary comes in that could be used to show, look, this works, this could work on a national scale, it's not making people lazy. I think that there's the potential to develop that in a way that could build support for something that's more permanent. But I think that needs to be it needs to be conceptualized as not just a short-term program. I think that needs to be built in. The ideal that this could be something that's long-term and permanent needs to be built in from the outset, so as to not make it easy to just give it up after the pandemic is over. That's my thought, is not unequivocally against something that's temporary, because even CERB, which is obviously temporary, we're still seeing so many people are left out of it. But at the same time, to not allow for something temporary that doesn't have, sort of a vision for something longer term, if that makes sense. That's my thought. If other folks want to add in, I'm very happy for them too.
Yeah, so anyone else on whether or not we should have another temporary program or a pilot project to see if this could be a long-term thing, recognizing one just wrapped up prematurely in Ontario and there's been other studies in the 70s in Manitoba? Tom, was that a hand or? Nope, okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, sorry, do you mind if I chime in on the pilot thing?
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah, there's been dozens of pilots around the world. There's a lot of data to show that this is good. And they all pretty much say the same thing, that there's negligible effects on full-time employment except for young mothers and people that go back to school. Reductions in crime and health. They all pretty much say the same thing. And I'm of the belief that rolling out another pilot is just kicking the can down the road a few years. Like, what could we learn from a new pilot that we don't already know? Right. There's one thing that we could learn. And, if I was to take the other position, I'd say, and this is something that Kate Graham, a former Ontario Liberal Party leadership candidate, has said. She's really for basic income. There's one thing that you could learn, which is how it interacts with provincial social assistance programs. I think that's a fair argument, right? But that does not take 4 years to know, right? Launching another 4-year pilot program would pretty much duplicate what we've already done in the past. And the MINCOME project to date is still one of the most highly referenced basic income projects in the world. And that was like decades ago, right? And even the unfinished Ontario Basic Income pilot program is still seen as Canada taking a leadership role in this movement, right? So I really think there's anybody who proposes, whether it's a senator or an MP, that proposes that a pilot is the right way to go, you really have to ask them to answer the question, what do you want to learn that we don't already know?
Good point, Ken. So Katrina, I recognize you had the question about youth messaging. I'm thinking that might be a nice way to conclude. So we're going to hold that question. We'll come back to it in about 10 minutes to kind of rally us together on that, because it's a very opportune moment for you to ask that. So I appreciate it. But Joanna, you have your hand up. So we'll go to you now. And Katrina, we'll come back to your question in about 10 minutes.
I think Joanna and Leah both had their hands up. So I don't know if Leah, I'm okay, whichever of you wants to go first, but I think it was Leah and then.
Oh, sorry, Leah. Okay, so go for it, Leah.
I can go. Okay. So my name's Leah. I'm based in Manitoba and I sit on the provincial working group for Make Poverty History Manitoba. And so I kind of had two questions. I'll just put them both out there. One, since I live in a province that obviously has a lower cost of living than many others in Canada, I'm wondering how that topic has come into like a nationalized context. Like, how do you see cost of living being considered in a basic income platform, if that has been discussed? The second is, if the group that is currently gathering and connecting on this has connected with like youth aging out of care and those movements in Canada. Specifically in Manitoba, there's been a big push for youth aging out of care to be pushed up to 25, not 21. And so I think there's a lot of momentum that can be built in with that movement, and partially connecting to Indigenous youth within that context, because youth aging out of care, at least in our province, are at a 90% rate of being Indigenous. And so how those kind of contexts intertwine in this type of movement. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that, feel free.
Okay, I can talk about that first maybe, and then if other people would like to add in, that'd be great. So part of my entry point into basic income was also through a very comprehensive project that I was assigned in my social work practical placement at United Way to understand all the different ways that we measure low income in Canada and the different factors and considerations that go into the low income measurement, the LICO low income cutoff, and then the market basket measure. And I was asked with recommending, or I was tasked to recommend which measurement was the most accurate when we're, considering how to invest in social programs. Anyways, so I say all of that because there are so many details and so many factors that can be taken into consideration when we're deciding who qualifies as being like in living with low income and who qualifies as being in higher income brackets, all those types of things. And the process of making those considerations, is very complex. It's something that I'm really, really interested in and actually would love to talk with people more about. Most of my friends don't want to have these conversations with me about like the details of how we measure those things. But I would be more than happy to talk more with people in maybe another setting about that. But I guess I say that because I think ultimately when we're implementing a basic income, it will be up to the government who's implementing it to make those considerations. I would hazard a guess that they will be connected in with the ways that we measure income, security, and poverty currently. So probably using a market basket measure, which does take regional differences into account, so cost of living based on regions. As far as the component with youth aging out of care, I think that that's a really, really important avenue for us to be building a networking coalition, and it isn't something that we have considered previously. But I think that it would be really valuable. We're still very much in the early days of organizing. I think right now, I think political activism and organizing takes a long time, and so I think that it's an awesome avenue for us to be exploring moving forward.
Great, thanks, Kendall. So seeing no other movements to answer that, Chloe, do you want to jump in quickly?
I was not going to jump in, but I was, if no one else has specific comments on that, I would say Joanna has her hand raised.
Yes, perfect. Joanna, go for it.
Hi, everyone. So my question was sort of touched upon before in the sense of social programs that already exist, usually under provincial jurisdiction, and how those kind of fit in with a basic income framework. And I guess one of the main criticisms that I've been seeing, especially from sort of like more left activists, has been that UBI creates a pathway to governments kind of justifying austerity measures in the sense that they will cut inevitably, is what a lot of people say. They will inevitably then go and cut a whole ton of other social infrastructure that helps people above and beyond what UBI would be able to do, like whether that's drug programs, seniors programs, etc. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, what is a good response to that, and a response to other forms of austerity coming from UBI. You had touched again on like labor movement also. I've seen a lot of postings about how UBI basically will become like a bailout for companies, and of course that's not what I think a lot of people are hoping that UBI would become, or any kind of basic income, not just UBI. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, how do you respond to that other than just saying, that those problems can be fixed through organizing? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
My thought, and I'll be brief on this so someone else can jump in, but my thought is many governments over many years in many jurisdictions have already implemented austerity measures. And this plays to a point that Chloe said around, we have lots of evidence of what the status quo is now, and it's not working. And I think that another program isn't in and of itself what will lead to austerity measures. So while it could provide context or justification, obviously there needs to be a political will or a political party that already wants to have austerity, which we've seen time and time again already. So I don't think that this is going to be anything different than we've already seen for justifying austerity. It might be another reason people give, but it's not better or worse than anything that's already been said. Kendall, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'll just add too that I don't know, there's so many details about the implementation of a basic income to cover, and I wish we had more time all the time to talk about it. But I think as a group, as a network, we're pretty committed to the idea that basic income is not a silver bullet to end all social issues or social insecurity, and that it is an important step forward to better support the programs that already exist. So, for example, with the Ontario Basic Income Pilot having specific additional income supports available for people with disabilities, I think that's a very important part of a model that we would be in support of. And so I don't think that basic income can or should be like the only social program, the only income assistance program that we have. It's definitely important to make sure that it is just doing complementing things that already exist, and then incrementally moving towards addressing the income security programs that are broken, not really working, that can be replaced by basic income, but making sure that it is adequate. And I think that's about all I wanted to say on that.
I'll add to that super quickly, and I think Joanna and I, we chatted about this briefly in a previous call, but I think in terms of advocacy and what type of basic income people are calling for, I think in terms of whether a basic income will replace other systems or other programs, I think sometimes it just comes down to naming that that's not the kind of basic income that we'd want, and literally just saying we support a basic income that does not replace some of the really important services and programs that are already in place, particularly those that we know are particularly beneficial to youth, coming from a youth perspective. So I think that's a super simple thing to say, but just making sure that when we're talking about a basic income, we're acknowledging that it's not that type of basic income that we're asking for.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to go back to Katrina's last question. We have about 5 minutes left. Want to respect everyone's time, and also say that this is just the beginning of the conversation. It's really great that for the last 2 webinars that we've had, we've seen new people come. And we're hoping that will continue next week when we're going to regather to talk about basic income, particularly and exclusively for youth. The last 2 weeks have been a bit broader, but we really want to nail down the ways in which this is beneficial and frankly needed for the next generation of Canadians. So Katrina, that's why your question about what we'd say from a youth perspective is such a great way to close. And I'm hoping, if I could, maybe encourage those who haven't said anything to share why you've even come to this call and why basic income is something you're even considering from your perspective, because I just by a quick look, it looks like we're all under 35. So yeah, does anyone want to share that hasn't yet?
Hello?
Hi, Eric, go for it.
Hey, thanks, Robert. I can kind of condense it into a brief summary, the many plethora of reasons I have. But if I were to summarize it, I guess it'd be simply the absolute need we currently, and the growing need for it coming up. And so from a youth perspective, I think that's particularly important when we think of planning our futures, both as individuals, as families, especially for those of us who are thinking of kids and kind of their prospects in our future society and what that looks like. I think a few topics have been covered already in terms of what the future of work is. Again, presently there's issues. Those issues will only grow and be more glaring in the future. And as far as automation, work that is meaningless in a lot of ways. And the necessity for risk-taking as youth already, there is a limitation on how that is possible with growing student debts coming out of universities and so on. And this would just add that kind of to that burden. So there's a lot of things that are affecting kind of youth now, and I only see that getting worse in the future. And so as a concerned citizen and youth and prospective parent in the future, that'll something that's of concern. Yeah.
Hi there. Can I just add something as well? Sorry.
Yeah, we'll go Megan, then Tom. That's great.
So just quickly, I'm Megan. I was introduced to basic income through my master's research, and I think that part of my interest in it really stemmed from the fact that there is a new kind of recognition that the reason that people are in more precarious economic environments now is partly due to the fact that it's not really their own decisions anymore. It's things that are more systemic and larger issues in society that are really impacting their ability to succeed in the way that maybe generations did previously. And I think that that's also being really highlighted right now with the COVID pandemic, that people lost their jobs and are really struggling, and it's something that wasn't their choice that they made, and it's nothing to do with something that they may have done or the work that they had chose to be doing. It's just their jobs disappeared in the blink of an eye. And I think that that's something that basic income would really help to show people, that there is this underlying systemic condition that is in society that is going to proceed in the future, and that it will really help kind of younger people to at least create a better environment for themselves moving forward when you take those things into account.
Amazing, thank you. Tom, go for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom. I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan. I work as the marketing coordinator for Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation. And I'm really good friends with Chloe, so that's how I find myself here. But I'm also I'm very passionate about basic income. And I would say there's a lot of reasons as to why, but a lot of it comes down to, again, I'm not incredibly knowledgeable about it all, but I would say that a lot of it does come down to, I've worked with people in poverty and trying to alleviate poverty in a lot of different ways. And a lot of the systems that we have in place right now, I have a idea that they really aren't working, certain welfare programs and things like that. And basic income just kind of for me, it creates, I would say as a youth too, it creates a new level of hope of a different approach and a different way to maybe tackle these problems. Because I think it's also very clear that the current programs are just not working the way that they're intended to work. So for me, there's a level of hope that's around it, but then also a level of let's try something new. And yeah.
Excellent. So we have time for one more. Does anyone else want to add?
Can I just, sorry, super quickly, I just want to say I am so on board about the hope that there is with basic income. I think as a young person who is politically interested and motivated, there's not a lot that I get particularly excited about in the future of our work other than basic income. So thank you for that, Tom.
Yeah, nice way to end. I would also say that an area that needs hope, and I think basic income addresses directly, is climate change. We talked a bit about this last time, the ways in which having a bit more financial capacity and flexibility allows people, both individually but also collectively, to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. And if we can see the two coming together, which I think there's more and more research, at least I'm seeing people posting articles on social media these days about the connection between the two. I think that's a really great way for our generation to say, we know that economic and environmental justice go together. And if we can, make that part of our basic income messaging, that gives me hope as well. So all of that to say, we have a lot more to talk about. And I think that everyone has contributed a lot this evening. And we're hoping that you'll come back next week. We're going to do a call a week from tonight. We have a number of resources that we can share with you through an increasingly expanding resource folder that we have on Google Drive. These are early days for us. So if anyone wants to share with the group that's here tonight, feel free to send us those resources. We can put it in that file and then share that out. Also, we want to encourage you, if you have other questions that might need a bit more time to address or to do a bit more research before we come together as a group again, please do email them to us. You all have our email, and that will give us some time to do preparation. Next call, as I mentioned, is about where to from here for youth. So we'll talk specifically about basic income from a youth perspective. So I'm hoping, Katrina, particularly if you're looking for that feedback, you can join us again. But also, what do we do about it from here? So if we have a bunch of senators that are already caucusing and thinking about this, how can we work with their youth councils, or how can we put respectful, positive political pressure on them to make sure that they act on this? And then when they do, what can we do to ensure that Parliament goes and does the same? And of course, we're not just limited to institutions. We're also about building allyship with other youth organizations, nonprofit organizations, and even players in the private sector who are a key part to make sure that this is accepted across the country. So definitely stay tuned, and very much thank you to everyone who participated tonight. We're very glad you could be here. Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Ciao.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.